What happens when a widow, alone on the frontier, must choose between pride, survival, and the stranger who rides into her life? The wind carried more dust than hope across the cracked plains of West Texas. It was the summer of 1882, and the land had forgotten the taste of rain for 3 long months. The sun burned merciless overhead, splitting the earth into jagged lines like broken glass. Tumbleweeds rolled across empty homesteads where families had given up their fight with the land. Margaret Sullivan stood on her porch, shielding her eyes against the glare. At just 26, she looked older. Grief had carved its mark into her face, leaving beauty shaped by sorrow and strength. Her dark hair, streaked with early silver, was bound tight in a bun. The faded black dress she wore was her armor of mourning, the last piece of her husband Thomas she still held on to. 8 months had passed since the canyon accident that crushed Thomas beneath a fall of timber. People said he hadn't suffered. Margaret knew better. She had seen his broken body herself, and the memory followed her like a shadow. Overnight, she had become protector of 40 acres of stubborn land and a 4-year-old son who asked questions she didn't know how to answer. "Mama, the chickens are acting strange again," little Samuel called. His sandy hair glowed in the sun, but his gray eyes carried the same weight as hers. "They're just thirsty, sweet boy," she told him, though she knew it was more. The well was sinking low. Every trip with the bucket felt like gambling with fate. One slip down there, and Samuel would be alone in the world. When she hauled the bucket up, only half filled with murky water, her stomach tightened. The cattle already showed ribs through their hides. 3 calves were gone to the drought. Each loss chipped away at her chance of holding on. Her fears grew worse when a voice called her name. Elijah Morse, the bank's man, stood at her gate. His thin smile carried no kindness. He reminded her of the payment due in 2 months, suggested she sell, hinted about gossip in town. Margaret's jaw stayed tight, her voice steady. "This is my son's inheritance. I will not sell." But after he left, she leaned against the well, her strength cracking. In town, women moved away from her pew in church. They whispered that a widow working her own cattle was scandal enough, but wearing men's trousers was unholy. She had grown used to their stares, yet today the weight felt heavier. The sky turned amber as the sun lowered. That's when she saw him, a lone rider, just a speck at first, moving slow across the horizon. Stranger. Stranger meant danger. Her hand reached for the rifle propped on the porch. As the rider drew close, she saw the horse, a bay gelding, limping from a lost shoe. The man on its back sat tall despite exhaustion. His hat shaded his face until he pushed it back, revealing eyes the color of winter sky, pale, sharp, weary. His voice was rough but respectful. "Evening, ma'am. Name's Jake Ryland." Horse threw a shoe back a ways. "Wondered if I might use your tools to fix it." "I can pay for the trouble," Margaret studied him. Gun belt worn but neat, hands calloused but steady. Not a drifter hungry for violence. Still, her guard stayed high. "There's a forge in the barn," she said finally, "and water by the pump. Supper at sunset. Beans and cornbread." His smile, faint but real, reached those tired eyes. "Ma'am, after 3 weeks on jerky, that sounds fit for a king." Samuel peeked out from behind her skirts. Jake tipped his hat in gentle greeting. "Fine boy you've got there." Margaret's chest tightened. Outlaws didn't talk about nephews back in Missouri. This man wasn't lying about family. That night, after mending not just his horse but her broken gate and chicken coop, Jake took his meal with quiet gratitude. He didn't pry, didn't push, just sat at her table like he belonged there. When he offered to sleep in the barn, relief swept through her. She needed no whispers from town feeding more fire. But as she lay awake, hearing the steady rhythm of hammer on wood from earlier echo in her mind, she felt something dangerous. Hope. The morning came soft and pale. From the window she watched Jake stretch in the yard, wash at the pump, and catch her watching. Heat rose in her cheeks. Samuel ran to him with a broken toy horse. Jake knelt, fixed it with gentle hands, and handed it back whole. Margaret swallowed hard. That horse had been carved by Thomas, and she hadn't been able to mend it herself. Yet this stranger had done it in minutes. When Jake knocked politely on the door to thank her and settle what he owed, she tried to dismiss him. "We're square," but he lingered, eyes steady. "That roof needs work." "The corral, too. I'm not in a hurry to go anywhere. Let me trade labor for food and a place to sleep." Margaret should have refused. Already the curtains in town were twitching, but her roof leaked, the fence sagged, and her strength was running thin. She met his gaze and saw not pity, but respect. "I can't pay wages," she said at last. "Didn't ask for any," Jake replied, settling his hat back on. "I'll start with the roof." And with that, the widow's life began to change, one nail, one repaired board, one dangerous heartbeat at a time. The first week passed in a blur of hammer blows and dust. Jake worked from dawn until the last light faded, his hands steady, his manner calm. He patched the roof, mended the corral, and brought the windmill back to life with patient skill. He asked nothing in return except meals and a corner of the barn to sleep in. Margaret told herself it was only temporary. A week, maybe 2. But when she saw Samuel trailing after Jake like a shadow, peppering him with endless questions, her resolve began to bend. The boys' laughter, long absent from their cabin, returned with surprising ease. "Were you in the war?" Samuel asked one evening on the porch. Jake nodded slowly. "Yes, son. I was just a boy myself." Quote, "Did you kill anyone?" Margaret stiffened, ready to scold, but Jake held up a hand. "It's a fair question. Yes, I did. And it's nothing I'm proud of. War makes men do things they spend the rest of their lives trying to forget." Margaret saw the shadows cross his face. She remembered when the soldiers came home, changed men, their eyes hollow. She understood the weight he carried. Trouble came on the second week. 3 riders from town appeared at her gate. Bob Hutchkins from the saloon, Carl Meyer from the store, and Pastor Williams. They didn't dismount. "We heard you've got yourself a hired man, Widow Sullivan," Hutchkins said, his voice sharp. "I have help with repairs." "Yes." Margaret stood tall, apron dusted with flour, rifle leaning against the porch rail. "Living in your barn, eating at your table," Meyer added. "People are talking." "People always talk," Margaret replied coolly. "I've yet to see it mend a fence." Pastor Williams cleared his throat. "We're concerned for your reputation. A young widow, a strange man. Surely you can see how it looks." Before Margaret could answer, Jake appeared from around the corner, hammer still in hand. He stood easy but ready. "Morning, gentlemen. Unless you're here to help patch the roof, I'd best get back to it." The 3 men shifted uneasily, their bluster faltering under Jake's steady gaze. After a few muttered words, they turned and rode away. Margaret realized her hands were trembling. "They'll make trouble," she whispered. "Maybe," Jake said. "But bullies usually back down when faced head-on." He hesitated. "If my presence brings you grief, I'll move on." "No," she said too quickly, then caught herself. "There's still work to be done." That evening, after Samuel went to bed, Jake shared pieces of his past by the firelight. He'd once owned a ranch in Kansas, had a wife named Emily who died of fever. He had sold everything and drifted ever since, chasing work and outrunning grief. "Thought I was looking for something," he said softly. "Maybe I was just running." Margaret stared into the flames. "When Thomas died, I wanted to run too. But this land is all Samuel has of his father. I can't let it go." "It's good land," Jake said, "worth fighting for. Especially when the world says you can't." His eyes met hers. "You're stronger than you know, Margaret Sullivan." Her breath caught at the sound of her name on his lips. Something unspoken passed between them, sharp as lightning. She broke it by standing abruptly. "It's late." But in bed that night, she dreamed not of Thomas's broken body, but of pale blue eyes and the sound of a hammer steady as a heartbeat. The drought deepened. By the 3rd week, the cattle staggered under the sun. Their eyes were dull, their ribs sharp. "They won't last," Jake said, watching them from the fence. "The nearest water is Clear Creek, 20 miles through Carson's Gulch. 2 days drive in their condition. Then we start tomorrow." Margaret said, "These are my cattle." "My responsibility." Jake nodded once. "We'll take Samuel to the Johansons. It'll be safer." That night they packed water bags and supplies. Samuel clung to his mother's skirts, eyes wide. "Will you come back?" he asked. "I'll always come back to you," Margaret promised, kissing his hair. They left before dawn. Dust rose around the weary cattle as they pushed forward under the unrelenting sun. By evening, they camped in a box canyon. Jake built a careful fire while Margaret tended the horses. "You handle those cattle like you were born to it," Jake observed, handing her coffee. "My father raised beef in Tennessee before the war," she said. "I could rope and ride before I could read." She hesitated. Thomas never liked that, said it wasn't fitting for a woman. "Thomas was a fool then," Jake said, then stopped himself. "Forgive me." Margaret stared into the fire. He was a good man in his way. But he wanted a wife who'd be content with sewing and cooking. He got something else. He got someone who could save his legacy. Jake said firmly, "That's worth more than any needlepoint." The moment was broken by the sound of hooves. 3 riders emerged from the dark. At their head was Bill Carver, a man with a reputation black as tar. His grin showed tobacco-stained teeth. "Well, well." "Jake Ryland." "Been a while since Dodge City." Jake's voice went quiet and dangerous. Carver's eyes slid to Margaret. "This your woman?" "Pretty thing to be dragging through the desert." "The lady is driving her cattle to water," Jake said evenly. "We want no trouble." Carver laughed. "Those skeletons? Hardly worth the effort. Maybe there's other things worth taking." Margaret stood, her hand on her rifle. "You're on my land, Mr. Carver." "Move along, Carver," sneered widow playing rancher. "Maybe you need a real man." Quote. What happened next was quicker than a blink. Jake's gun cleared leather and fired. Carver's hat spun into the dirt, a bullet hole neat through the crown. "The next one goes lower." Jake said calmly, "The lady asked you to leave." For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Then Carver retrieved his hat, his face twisting. "This ain't over, Ryland. Or you, widow woman." When they were gone, Margaret realized she was shaking. Jake holstered his gun. "You all right?" "You knew him before," she said. Jake's jaw tightened. "We had a disagreement in Dodge. He won't forget it, and he won't forgive." That night they kept watch in shifts, rifles close, the fire burning low. Margaret lay awake, listening to Jake's steady breathing nearby, and wondered if she had just gained an ally or inherited an enemy she could not afford. Dawn broke sharp and cold, but Margaret's stomach still twisted with unease. The cattle drank greedily at Clear Creek, splashing in the shallows, their ribs less sharp already. Relief washed through her, but it didn't last. Carver's parting words still rang in her ears. By the 3rd day, they turned the herd back toward the ranch. The journey home was slow but steady, each mile a small victory. But Margaret noticed Jake scanning the horizon constantly, hand never far from his revolver. When they drove the herd into the paddock, neighbors were already whispering. By sunset, all of Cedar Ridge knew the widow Sullivan had spent nights on the trail with her. Quote, "hired man." Margaret held her head high, but she felt the sting of gossip cut deeper than any blade. That evening, Jake offered to ride into town alone for supplies. "Might be easier if you stay clear of the talk." "He said I won't hide in my own home." Margaret shot back. "Not now." "Not ever," Jake studied her, those pale eyes soft with admiration, stubborn woman. Trouble came sooner than she expected. Dalton, the rich rancher whose spread bordered hers, arrived with the bank's man in tow. He tipped his hat with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'll be straight. This land's too much for a woman alone. I'm offering you a fair price, enough to set you up in town. Refuse, and the bank will take it come due day." "The land isn't for sale," Margaret said firmly. Dalton's smile thinned. "You've got 3 weeks. Think carefully." After they rode off, Margaret sagged against the porch post, but Jake's hand on her shoulder steadied her. "We'll fight," he said simply. Days blurred into work and worry. Jake rode for a cattle drive to earn money, leaving Margaret aching with fear and longing. When he returned weeks later, it was just in time to pull her from a burning barn set ablaze by Carver's men. His arms around her, soot in his hair, he whispered fiercely, "Don't you dare give up. You're not alone." Together they rebuilt with salvaged wood and the kindness of neighbors who hadn't forgotten Margaret's past help. Donations trickled in, coins, food, tools, enough to scrape together the bank payment. Still, Dalton struck again, claiming her deed was false. In court, the whole town gathered to watch her fate. Dalton's surveyor swore the boundaries were wrong. Margaret's stomach sank until old Henrik Johansson stepped forward, weathered notebook in hand. He swore under oath he'd helped Thomas mark the land with federal stones years ago. Gasps filled the courtroom when Pastor Williams, pale but resolute, added that he had overheard Carver bragging about digging up those very markers. The judge's gavel came down hard. Until proven otherwise, the Sullivan ranch remains in Mrs. Sullivan's hands. Dalton stormed out, Carver glaring like a man with murder in his eyes. Outside the courthouse, neighbors shook Margaret's hand. Samuel clung to her skirts, whispering, "Does this mean we keep our home?" "Yes, sweet boy," she said, choking on tears. "We keep our home." Beside her, Jake went to one knee, voice rough Margaret Sullivan. "I've got no ring, no fancy words, just my whole heart. I want to be Samuel's father, your husband, and your partner in this fight, if you'll have me." Her answer came in a whisper, then a kiss in front of the whole town. They married under spring blossoms. Neighbors gathered with laughter and fiddle music. Samuel carried the rings, grinning ear to ear. When the pastor spoke the vows, Margaret's voice didn't tremble. "To stand beside you against all who would harm our family, to love you with all I am, forever." That night, rain finally fell. Sweet, clean, life-giving rain soaking the earth, the cattle, the new barn, and the hearts of 2 people who had fought too hard to give in. On the porch, lightning flashing across the sky, Jake pulled Margaret close. His voice was low, rough with truth. "I'd trade 10 herds for 1 night with you." Margaret pressed her forehead to his. "Good thing you don't have to. You've got every night, forever." Quote. And as thunder rolled and Samuel slept safe inside, the widow and the cowboy sealed their promise with a kiss that tasted not of dust and fear, but of hope and the second chance they both thought they'd never find.